Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Hope everyone is doing well. Today I have 6 true ghost stories from the Haunted Canada series. If I pronounce anything wrong, I do apologize. A ghostly guest appearance, Georgetown, Prince Edward Island. The ghost who haunts another theater, this time in Georgetown, Prince Edward Island, doesn't mind being seen. He inhabited the historic town hall, which became the King's Theatre, before it suffered a serious fire in 1983, and he continued to reveal himself in the King's Playhouse that rose from its ashes a few years later. Like Sam, the Calgary ghost haunting the Planetarium Theatre, he's been given a name, Captain George, and he's a bit of a prankster. Wearing an old-fashioned military officer's greatcoat and carrying a lantern, he suddenly appears on stage or behind the scenes, leaving both crews and actors feeling more than a little uneasy. He's also been known to upset a few theater goers by briefly gripping their ankles. Managers at the theater finally decided to take a firm but friendly approach to dealing with Captain George, specifically for him, hoping that he'd stay put in it instead of roaming around disturbing people, especially during performances. If only he would. Death at the Mill, Manotick, Ontario. Joseph Merrill Currier was a self-made man. Born in Vermont in 1820, he moved to the Ottawa Valley when he was 17 and found a job as a lower-level employee of a lumber company. Within a few years, he had worked his way up to the position of manager of 3 different lumber firms. And by the late 1840s, he had earned a reputation around the Ottawa area as a savvy businessman. In the 1850s, he and another successful lumberman, Moss Kent Dickinson, became partners, building a large sawmill and then a grist mill for grinding grain on the Rideau River of Manotick, Canada West. But Currier's personal life didn't follow the same successful path. In 1855, scarlet fever claimed the lives of his children. 3 years later, his wife Christina died, so he couldn't believe his good fortune when in 1860, while vacationing on Lake George in New York State, he met a beautiful young woman who seemed to be interested in him. Anne Crosby was half Currier's age, but that difference didn't stop the couple from falling in love, and they were married in January of 1861. After honeymooning in the United States for a month, Currier brought his bride back to Ottawa. Currier was proud of his accomplishments. He was especially proud of the flour mill he and Dickinson had built in Manotick. Business was booming there, and a thriving village was taking shape around it. The mill had begun operating in 1860, and its first anniversary was coming up. So Currier thought a visit there would be a great way to introduce Anne to friends in the area and to show off the mill to her. However, early on in the couple's visit, tragedy struck. Currier had walked Anne around the property, pointing out to her how water flowing over a dam on the river powered the machinery that turned the large stones grinding wheat into flour. Then it was time to tour the 4-story stone building itself. When they reached the second floor where the milestones were turning, Anne's long skirt and petticoat got caught in the revolving mechanism that drove the stones. In an instant, she was thrown violently against a large support pillar and slumped to the floor, bleeding. Horrified, Currier ran to her, but there was nothing he could do. His beautiful wife was dead. Currier wanted nothing to do with the mill after that. He would never again enter the room where bloodstains from the horrifying accident remained permanently soaked into the wooden pillar, and he would never return to Manotick, but it appears that his bride, or more specifically her spirit, never left. Over the years since Annie's death, several people have reported seeing a beautiful young woman in a long dress looking out of second-floor window of the mill. Others have been frightened to hear blood-curdling screams coming from the mill at night when no one was there. Watson's Mill, as it's now known, was bought and restored by the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority in the 1970s, and has become a popular tourist attraction. It's one of a few grist mills that they are still operating in Ontario, but some visitors have felt very uncomfortable, especially when they are on the second floor. They start to feel a shiver and feel cold there even on scorching hot summer days. And they have a sense that someone is watching them and wishes they would leave. Many believe that someone is Anne, her spirit trapped forever where she met such a horrible fate. Perhaps she is wishing she could leave too. Joseph Currier married again 7 years after Anne died. His third wife was Hannah Wright from Hull, Quebec. Hoping to start life afresh, he built a fine new home for Hannah, who came from a well-off family used to entertaining in a grand style. The limestone mansion sat on a large tree cover lot overlooking the Ottawa River. Currier called the place Gorfwisfa, a Welsh word meaning a peaceful place. He lived there until his death in 1884, and Hannah stayed on in Gorfwisfa until she died in 1901. The stately house still stands in Ottawa, and Canadians like to think that the families who have lived there over the past many years have indeed found it to be a peaceful place. Its address, 24 Sussex Drive, the official home of Canada's Prime Minister since 1951. A Disturbing Quest, Winnipeg, Manitoba. The impressive-looking building at 335 Donald Street, just north of Portage Avenue in Winnipeg, was built in 1895, known as the Old Masonic Temple. It was the headquarters for local lodges or branches of the Masonic Order, a somewhat secretive men's organization whose members pledge loyalty to each other and support efforts to help others in the community. In 1969, not long after the Masons sold it, the building became home to a Mother Tucker's restaurant, and although the owner of the restaurant chain denied it, it was also home to a ghost. One server working there in August of 1979 actually saw the ghost for a few seconds. The apparition was that of a tall young man in a top hat and old-fashioned dress coat standing off to one side of the main road. But several other staff members who encountered the unusual restaurant guest usually just heard it or saw signs that it had been moving around the place. After the restaurant closed, servers would tidy up and set the table so they would be ready for the next day's customers. But some mornings when they returned, they would find serviettes wrinkled up, salt and pepper shakers knocked over, sugar spilt, and knives and forks lying in disarray. As one waiter put it, the dining room looked as if someone had a party there in the middle of the night. Tom Seiko, the manager at the time, reported that he and others would occasionally hear mysterious footsteps moving around overhead, even though he had just done a security check of the upper floors before locking up. One night, sounds of a vicious argument were also heard coming from an empty room upstairs. Generally speaking, though, staff of Mother Tucker's felt they would put up with the mysterious presence that seemed to prefer haunting the upper floors. They just did not want to be alone with it, especially not at night, after closing time. A Wraith on the Ward, Vancouver, British Columbia. At the time, back in the mid-1970s, officials at Vancouver General Hospital thought it would be best if the public didn't know the hospital's burn unit might be haunted. They were probably right. After all, knowing that a ghost could be helping out with their nursing care might not be much a comforting thought for most patients suffering from very serious burns. But if nurses were right about identifying him, the unit's ghost would have been very sympathetic toward their suffering. In life, he had himself spent 3 agonizing months bravely fighting to recover from horrible burns over much of his body. The young man, referred to here as Jim, his real name was never publicly associated with the haunting, was one of 16 workers seriously injured in a major explosion and fire in a grain elevator at the Burrard Dock facilities in October 1975. Jim's injuries were the most serious. He was listed in critical condition and wasn't expected to survive. But isolated in room 415 to reduce the chance of infection, Jim somehow found the will to live and to cope with the excruciating pain caused by his third-degree burns. However, over the next several weeks, his heroic battles sapped his strength, and 3 months after the fire, he died. Nurses who had cared for Jim were very sad when he died, But in the weeks and months following his death, they began to think his spirit lived on in the burn unit, and not just in their tender memories of him. When some of them entered room 415 to check on a patient, they began to feel that another invisible presence had entered with them. When Nurse Denny Conrad was in the room one day getting it ready for the arrival of a new patient, he thought another staff member had followed him in, carrying a tray of bandages. But then he turned around, the tray fell, and there was no one else there. That incident disturbed Conrad. He didn't like the idea of being in the same room as a ghost, even if it was Jim's. Another nurse who went into room 415 when no patient was there heard sounds of deep breathing coming from the empty bed and saw the sheets move as if a patient were tossing and turning. There were also reports of Jim visiting burn victims on the ward. One critically ill woman mentioned she just had a visit from a kindly young man she didn't know. The nurse was surprised to hear this since, as with Jim, the woman was being kept in isolation and was only allowed visits from members of her immediate family. Another time, a patient in room 413, beside Jim's old room, asked a nurse to pass along his thanks to the nice young doctor who had spent time with him the night before, helping him cope with his pain. The nurse was fairly certain no doctor had been on the ward then, but she checked the records to make sure and saw that she was right. Curious, she went back and asked the patient to describe what the doctor had looked like. She wasn't all that surprised when the patient described a man who looked just like Jim. However, she didn't tell the patient what she was thinking, that Jim's ghost had been making his rounds. Most of the burn unit staff at the time felt that Jim's spirit was trying to be helpful when it actually made an appearance. Those occurrences were disturbing, but tolerable. However, some other ghostly activities were upsetting and even disruptive at times. Icy blasts of air would suddenly fill room 415. Taps opened and the toilet flushed when the bathroom was empty, and the lights often switched on and off on their own. The signal to call for a nurse's assistance would also be triggered when no patient was in the room. Some people thought that these eerie encounters were Jim's way of letting them know he was still there. Shortly before the burn unit was moved to another wing during the hospital's expansion, the unsettling incident stopped. Nurses who had cared for Jim hoped that meant he had found pain-free rest at last. The Dark Lady, Hamilton, Ontario. The old custom house at 51 Stewart Street in the north end of Hamilton is a magnificent stone building that is considered a National Historic Site. Opened in 1860, it was designed to look like many official buildings and museums constructed in Italy in the 19th century. It was built to house government workers who kept track of goods moving in and out of the city's busy port on Lake Ontario and who collected duties or special taxes on many imported products. Customs officials moved out in 1887, and over the next 100 or so years, the building had many different owners and tenants. It became a temporary elementary school, a branch of the YMCA, a rooming house, a shelter for the homeless, several workplaces including factories that made vinegar, woolen yarn and pasta, a martial arts academy, and a computer company. In the late 1980s, the Ontario government spent a lot of money to help the karate school renovate and restore the building. In 1995, the current owner, the Ontario Workers' Arts and Heritage Centre, bought it, using it to focus on the history and cultural contributions of Canada's working-class men and women. In 2001, the centre changed its name to the Workers' Arts and Heritage Centre. But while the owners and uses of the custom house changed many times over the course of its colorful history, one thing stayed the same: the claim that the stately stone building was haunted by a ghost known as the Lady in Black, or the Dark Lady. The Dark Lady is said to live in the basement of 51 Stewart Street, but she seems to move around a lot. There have been reported sightings of a beautiful woman appearing in a top-floor window of the building. However, a much older woman, all dressed in black, was also appeared in that place. In one instance decades ago, a worker named Mr. Hanman saw just the shadowy shape of a woman gliding along a wall. Years later, during the restoration, one member of the construction crew saw the Black Lady clearly and got a sense that she was upset by the changes going on around her. especially plans to move the mantelpiece around one fireplace. Perhaps that's why she kept moving their tools after they went home for the day, and why she may have caused a major roof leak and flooded several rooms soon after the mantel was moved. Several workers also experienced a very strange, uncomfortable sensation and a blast of frigid air when they worked in the basement. At least 2 stories offer a possible explanation for tragic figure's lingering presence in the custom house. One says that she's the ghost of an unidentified immigrant who died on a ship that arrived in Hamilton and whose body was burned in the basement. Legend has her roaming in the place for all these years as she waits for her lover to join her in Canada. Another tale that circulated years ago was about a ship's captain who murdered his wife and buried her there after she found out that he had a girlfriend and demanded that he end the affair. There seems to be no evidence backing up either possibility. However, evidence that the Dark Lady has been around for a very long time may be found in a ballad by Hamiltonian Alexander Wingfield that was published in 1873 titled The Woman in Black. The poem begins with a specific reference to what the ghost wore. The ghosts long ago used to dress in pure white. Now they're got on a different track. For the Hamilton ghost seems to take a delight to stroll around the city in black. Wingfield then goes on to tell how frightened a policeman was when he suddenly encountered the black-garbed spectre while walking the beat near the custom house one night. A peeler who met her turned blue with affright, and in terror he clung to a post. His hair, once a carroty red, has turned white, since the moment he looked on the ghost. Wingfield ends the poem rather dramatically, a few verses later telling of how the poor officer was found frozen with fear at 2 a.m., still clinging to the lamppost. But according to another earlier verse, his terror was understandable. The apparition he saw was much more horrifying than the one usually seen at the custom house. Her breath seemed as hot as a furnace besides. It smelt strongly of sulphur and gin. 2 horns, a yard long, stuck straight out of her head, and her hoofs made great clatter and din. The ghost sounds absolutely demonic. Fortunately for those who've spotted the ghostly woman in black at 51 Stewart Street since that poem was published, the spectre they've seen doesn't smell of sulphur and gin, and she doesn't have horns or hoofs. The Maybe Ghost, Orwell River, Prince Edward Island. James Hayden Fletcher didn't believe in ghosts. As a young boy growing up in a small community at the mouth of the Orwell River, about 25 kilometers east of Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, he and his siblings loved hearing the spooky stories that workers at his father's sawmill would tell as they sat around the fireplace at the end of the day. The stories filled them all with a delicious mix of excitement and fear. When he grew up, Fletcher was a little disappointed but very relieved to find out that most of those tales were grounded not in facts, but in Irish and Scottish superstitions, and he stopped believing in ghosts. He even went so far as to try to convince friends and neighbors who did that they were foolish to do so. Still, in an article titled The Ghost Story, published in the Prince Edward Island magazine in 1900, when he was about 60, Fletcher admitted that those scary stories still had an impact on him as a non-believing adult. He confessed that whenever I got into a suspicious place after dark, I always looked over my shoulder to make sure that no unnatural visitor was crawling on me from behind. So it didn't come as a surprise that as a young man he started feeling very nervous walking home from the blacksmith shop after dark one night, especially when he realized he would have to pass by an old graveyard. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but when he came to the cemetery gate, he couldn't resist. Turning toward it, he immediately wished he hadn't. Decades later, Fletcher still remembered vividly what he saw that night. A mysterious, tall, white figure. In the Ghost Story article, he wrote about how he felt at that moment. In spite of my philosophy, I felt my hat rise from my head. I looked out into the darkness again and saw it move. There was no mistake about it. The spectre continued to move. It slowly began to advance toward me. It gradually appeared to grow taller and whiter. Fletcher was terrified, but he decided not to run, just in case the ghostly figure was the spirit of a close friend who wanted to communicate with him. A strange thought for someone who didn't believe in ghosts. Instead, he decided to speak to it. "How do you do?" he asked, and was incredibly relieved to hear a human voice answer, "Well, thank the Lord." Fletcher recalled, "It was the most welcome sound I ever heard, and yet I became so weak I would scarcely walk." But walk Fletcher did, as quickly as he could, not lingering to chat with the white-robed figure, whom he thought he recognized as an old fellow from New Perth known as Crazy Donald Gordon. Gordon had apparently become mentally ill in his old age, and had started wearing strange robes and performing bizarre religious rituals. Fletcher assumed Gordon had been saying prayers for the dead in the graveyard. Nevertheless, he readily admitted that nothing he had ever seen in his whole life had ever frightened him so badly as the appearance of the white-robed man in the cemetery. But could Fletcher's first impression that a ghost was moving toward him have been correct? After all, he did mention in his article that Gordon had scarcely ever been seen before the vicinity of Orwell. He also referred to the man as a patriarch, the head of a large family. A few old records point to the possibility that one Donald Gordon, who fathered many children, may have already been dead when Fletcher walked past the graveyard. Of course, records can be incorrect or incomplete, but maybe they weren't. Maybe Fletcher, the man who didn't believe in ghosts, had very good reason to be afraid that night. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking my channel, and I will see you on the next one.